Yeah. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. Has anybody heard of this? Okay, this is very, very powerful, 1 to 3 Tesla. So basically what they do is they give a strong magnet to the brain, and it depolarizes those neurons very, very powerfully. So they only do it briefly, 4 to 6 seconds, and then 26 seconds off. The reason they only do it briefly is because it can heat up the brain and cause brain damage. So you can't keep it going, right? So it has to be very, very brief. Now, it's not that this is bad, it's just that the individual has to know how to do it. This is not a do-it-yourself kind of thing. You have to have a very knowledgeable person doing this to make sure that you don't damage your brain. Because you can fry the brain. I've seen there's a new documentary on PBS. It was called The Brain. It was some neuroscientist, but you can a neurotypical individual, you can do this right on their brain, and they'll start slurring their words and speaking like they just had a stroke because it's so powerful. So they'll hit them once with a magnet, and it'll just completely depolarize the brain, and it'll take a while for them to get their function back, their expressive language, right? And it's quite interesting. So, you know, it's a very powerful. This is mostly research-based right now. I don't know of a lot of clinics doing this. It can be very powerful, but you have to be very, very careful with the technology. It was approved by the FDA in 2008 for depression, and you know, headaches, muscle soreness, and it can heat brain tissue, so you have to be very, very careful. So, anytime you're not only, when you send this signal through, you're not only causing the neurons to fire, but you're also causing the muscles on the scalp to fire. Right? So everything's electrical. Your muscles are electrical, your brain's electrical. So if those muscles contract really, really hard, you're obviously going to get some muscles.
Brainstorm.
It is, yeah. That's one of my talks, actually, brainstorm. So yeah, this is very limited on the hertz that they can do. They can't go very high in the frequency because they'll fry your brain. So you got to keep it really, really low and keep it very short stimulation. So it was developed in the 1980s, and there's a lot of research. It's still research, mostly clinical, so I don't know many clinics doing that. So. This is pulsed electromagnetic fields. Now what's cool about this is that we're using magnetic stimulation, but at a much, much less decreased intensity. So this is only 1 to 50 microtesla. So remember, this is 1 to 3 Tesla. So we're talking about 10,000 times weaker on this microtesla. So there's no chance you're going to fry the brain. And what's interesting about this is Dr. Schumann, he was a professor, and he discovered that the Earth, back in the 50s, actually had a pulse. The Earth is giving off these pulsed electromagnetic fields. So the Earth is, right, these pulses. And he found these pulses, and they were at 7.83 hertz, and it's called the Schumann resonance. If you guys want to see a really interesting documentary, watch Resonance, and it talks about this. Well, they noticed, remember the space race? You guys are, some of you are a bit older than me. I don't remember it too well, but I've heard about it and read about it. But I remember the space race, the Russians and the Americans were trying to get into space. But they were finding that astronauts in space for long periods of time were coming back having a lot of fatigue, depression, and bone loss. They figured the bone loss was due to lack of gravity, but they were like, why is the fatigue and depression occurring? Well, they discovered that because when they're in space, in these space shuttles and these space capsules for a long period of time, they're not getting the Earth's pulsed electromagnetic frequencies. We evolved to get these things. They're very, like, you've heard of earthing, where you touch the ground, you walk on the sand. That's what that does. It actually gives you that stimulation from the Earth. But when you're that far away from the Earth, you're not getting it. So it was affecting their brain. So what they started doing, they got very smart. They started adding these electromagnetic pulses into their space shuttles, and they remedied all that. By the way, the bone loss wasn't just because of lack of gravity. They also found out that the electromagnetic fields enhanced the bone loss. So it's not just about a lack of gravity. Well, so this is what we're doing now with this stuff and this discovery. So basically what we can do is we can give the brain one of these electromagnetic frequencies, and it copies it. And it's really, really cool. So that we can tell the brain essentially what we want it to do. If we see the brain's running too fast, we can give this electromagnetic field to say, okay, brain, we want you to run slower, and the brain will actually copy that. And you can see it on the EEG, so it's really cool. It's not just theory, you can actually see it happen. And we can go all the way up to 300,000 hertz, which you can't do with this, right? You can only give up to 10 hertz because you'll fry your brain. But this one you give all the way up to 300,000 hertz, so you have much more flexibility on it, and it's really, really neat to be able to do.
So what is Tesla? I know Tesla.
Yeah, Tesla did really neat stuff. And then we can do, this is, not very many docs in the world can do this, but what we can do because of our technology, we can do what's called cross-frequency coupling. So we can give two frequencies at once. Remember I talked about that gamma? We can give that slow carrier wave, let's say somebody's brain is running too fast. We can give like a slow delta wave, and then give that quick gamma on top. And what that does, it allows us to connect distant parts of the brain, which you can't do with many of the other technologies. You can actually connect long distances from the front to the back of the brain, or from the cortex all the way down. So it's really, really neat stuff. It's amazing technology. The inventor is brilliant. Yeah, it's very, very cool. You don't feel anything through these coils. The individual is not going to feel even a tingling sensation because it's electromagnetic. So what it does, it passes a current through the brain, and it passes a magnet. And what the magnet does is it actually causes a current within the brain, these microcurrents in the brain. I know there's some practitioners using magnetic resonance therapy, or MRT, which is a similar form of this. What I tend to see with a lot of practitioners is that they're picking and choosing different things like magnetic resonance therapy, or alpha stim, or microcurrent. They're using one, or surface neurofeedback. Very few are using a bunch of different technologies, a composite of all the different ones. And that's what I wanted to do, to make sure I had a lot of different options, because just using one thing, would get boring to me, first of all. Plus, there's things that you can't address with just one technology, so having as many as you can really, really helps. So this is, when we're training these brains, what we're doing is we're doing either entrainment or disentrainment. Entrainment is what I was talking about. You give a stimulation, and you want the brain to entrain or habituate. I use another term called habituate. The brain to copy it. And just like a habit, you want the brain to start doing that. So it's called entrainment or habituation. Training the brain to develop a new habit and start those new frequencies. So that can be done in isolation by itself, so we can just do that stimulation by itself, with or without a good history of brain function. So whether the child was damaged at birth, like from hypoxia, or a problem like that, or later on, it doesn't matter. You can give these entrainment. Disentrainment is different. That's where it's also called dehabituation. We essentially give a random stimulation to reset the brain. So are you guys familiar with when somebody has a heart attack and they use the paddles on their heart? Essentially what they're doing is they're basically resetting the heart. So it stops the heart and allows it to reset. That's similar to what this is doing. We're not stopping the brain, but we're creating some confusion in the brain, taking the stimulation off and letting the brain reset itself. Now, you can't do this in isolation if somebody doesn't have a good premorbid history, or they didn't have healthy brain function to begin with. So you can use this in combination with this if they didn't have good healthy brain function. You cannot use this in isolation. So for instance, I have an Alzheimer's patient that I'm using this with, and I can use this in isolation because before he started having symptoms, he was very, very capable, right? He was a very smart golfer, and he was doing very well. But now he's not doing so hot, so we're using this in isolation and in combination. So, does that make sense on that? Entrainment versus disentrainment, habituation versus dehabituation. Hopefully I don't break this. Yeah, it's awesome. So that's what we were talking about there was called neurostimulation, essentially. This is different. And how many here are familiar with, first of all, how many of you were familiar with neurostimulation in the first place? A few of you. How many of you have heard of neurofeedback? This is different, neurofeedback. Okay, this is different. So neurofeedback, it's interesting, Dr. Sturman, what they did is they wanted to see if he could make cats train their brain waves to function like he wanted them to. So he wanted to see, can we even train a cat to do what we wanted to do by rewarding the cat with these food pellets? And they figured out that they could actually control, the cats would change their brain waves in order to get these food pellets. It was really, really cool. It's called operant conditioning. And soon thereafter, NASA actually recruited them to do experiments on rocket fuel. Because what happened with rocket fuel is that astronauts were being exposed to this and having major seizures, and some would die. So there was experiments, and what they figured out was that the cats that had gone through this training were protected from seizures. They didn't have any idea about this before, but they were protected from seizures. So they're like, okay, what's going on here? And they figured out that because they had trained within this certain frequency called sensory motor SMR, essentially, it's 12 to 15 hertz, but they had trained within this frequency. This is protective against seizures. I love seizures in epilepsy patients because you can really, train them to reduce their seizures significantly. Anybody here have adults or children with seizure disorders or themselves have seizure disorders? Yeah, so it's very, very common. What happens with a seizure disorder, oftentimes it's in that very slow frequency, in that theta range, 4 to 8. That's where you tend to see most of the seizure disorders. So you can train them up and train their brain to run a bit faster, and then they don't get those seizure disorders, or they decrease significantly, and then they can start weaning off medications, which is very, very cool. I don't take anybody off medications, but I'll work with the individual's doctor in order if they want to wean down. So that's a goal for a lot of people is to get off medications. It's not always possible, but you can get off medications or at least reduce them because they won't become more sensitive to them. And so all the astronauts trained now, they do the neurofeedback to get that SMR brainwave so it protects them against seizures in case they have exposure to the rocket tube. 1980s, and then a lot of research came out. So it started with epilepsy. That was where most of the initial research came, and now ADHD in the 80s, and now it's just going crazy with the different research on all the different neurological issues that are going on. But if you look in the literature, you'll see most of the literature is on epilepsy and ADHD. There's a lot of emerging literature on a lot of other neurological issues right now too.
I'm sure you saw that CNN special about the marijuana that they gave that little girl who had like seizures every few minutes.
Yeah, the cannabinoid oil. Yeah.
It saved her life.
Yeah, the cannabinoid oil is very cool. As you know, it's oil. Yeah, so you can get it from hemp, the hemp plant. And it's such a shame. You guys knew the history of hemp and why it was outlawed.
I have
With developmental challenges, have a lot of problems in their subcortical structures like the limbic system. What does the limbic system do? It regulates emotions, right? The amygdala and anxiety and all sorts of things like that. So a lot of these children are stuck in this limbic activity. They don't have this higher functioning cortical activity. So they're a higher functioning executive function is not there because they're stuck in this primal fight or flight system, right? They have insomnia, they have anxiety, right? OCD issues, all those kinds of things. So they're stuck there, and you got to break that. And by hitting lower brain function, and by hitting the limbic system, you can really make some cool changes to the brain.
And you work in that area?
Yeah, I do all this stuff. Yeah. I don't do the electroconvulsive thing. Combo therapy, sorry, I meant to have a picture here. I was short on time today. I was in practice before I came here. But essentially, what this does is you can put all of these things together, which is really, really neat. And you can combine all these different therapies. You can do the gut. So for instance, on a kid that's having major gut and brain issues, you can first do the gut, control that, and then go right to the brain. And you can dehabituate or disentrain the brain, reset it, and then show the brain what you want it to do with these different therapies. So you can do everything, which is really, really cool, and you get really a lot quicker changes than doing things in isolation. So post-electromagnetic fields here on the gut and the brain. RTZ just means real-time z-scores. So basically, we just train them. We have this database that what normal should be, and we can compare that to normal and train them towards the normal by using stimulation and the TDCS and the neurofeedback. That's what NFB is. So these are some of the articles. I mean, there are literally thousands of articles now on these types of technologies, especially on neurofeedback. There's emerging research now on transcranial and some on pulse electromagnetic frequencies, but those are relatively new technologies. So it's an emerging field, and it's impossible to keep up with, even for myself. I just hired a new neurotherapist. He's a graduate from a neuroscience program, and he's going to be my go-to study guy. He's going to be reading these studies for me and give me the synopsis so that I can keep up with this stuff. Yeah, if you look, there's tons of stuff on there right now. Yeah, and this is next to last slide here, but this is the quote I have on the back of my car because I thought it was really cool. I am convinced he was a 19th century physicist and physician. He said, "I'm convinced that the therapy of the future." I shouldn't say that. I'm convinced that the therapy of the future will employ heat, light, electricity, and agents yet unknown. Toxic drugs shall cede their place to physical agents, at least the employment of which at least has the advantage of not introducing any foreign body into the organism. I did some misspellings there. But essentially, he was really ahead of his time developing this stuff back in 1896. And then that's just the name of the practice, Brain Solutions San Diego. So